Very special thanks to Affordable Prestige Cars in Glastonbury for providing the Mercedes in this review, and as I always like to do, I've linked to their website and all of the info and their current inventory down in the video description, so if you want to check out what cars they've currently got, maybe even this car if you're watching it as soon as possible after the release, then of course you can find all of that info right below this video. One of the earliest vehicle reviews I did in Beards and Cars was actually for a different version of this platform, the C32 AMG, and if I recall correctly, I think I mentioned in that video, and of course you can check this for yourself by clicking the annotation on the screen, I think I mentioned wanting and hoping to review a C55 in future to compare it to it. Well, here we are, because that's exactly what I'm doing. Now, the shocking thing to me, and for some people this might not be a surprise, but for me it really was, a pleasant one in fact, is that these cars are so much more different than I would have ever thought. It's not just a case of one car having a slightly bigger engine than the other or slightly more or less power. They feel legitimately like totally different models, even though they're both the C-Class. Now, one was the wagon and this one is the sedan, but I'm talking beyond that. And spoiler alert, I can very clearly tell you what kind of buyer should be looking into which one of those two cars right now. If you're younger, go for the C32. It feels like a hot hatch that happens to be in a wagon body. Very much so, in fact, like what you'd expect today from like a Volkswagen Golf R estate or a Skoda VRS estate. That's the kind of vibe that the C32 gives off. It's got that thumpy 6-cylinder engine, it's louder, it's more over the top, and it feels much happier through corners. Whereas this car is much more traditional and I would say geared toward what might be more of like a Jaguar owner's age, like 40s, 50s and beyond. Now, some of those owners might find it a little bit too powerful, but I think most won't. In fact, it feels quite similar, in my opinion, to what you'd expect from like a Jag S-Type R. It's that kind of power delivery where it's fairly understated. It's a big engine for sure, but it doesn't feel anywhere near as brutish as you would assume it would, and that is part of the reason why I think a younger driver might not enjoy it as much. Now, to speak to a couple of the things that I actually didn't like about this car, because there aren't that many, which is good, there are two things in particular. One is an important one, and one is more subjective. Now, the thing that I don't like is actually very similar to the main thing that I didn't like about the ML55. Same era of car from that Daimler-Chrysler merger, wherein a lot of Mercedes models became, no offense to my American fans and friends, too American. They felt soft, sluggish, bloated, and not really what a Mercedes should be like. In fact, one of the primary ways that you can feel that is the steering dead zone. You can move the steering wheel in the ML55 that I drove a good 6 or 7 inches to the left or right without the car actually changing direction. I hate that feeling because it makes the car feel really floaty and light and unsure of itself. This suffers from the same thing, although not as bad. Now, as I said, that may just be the cars that I was driving, but the fact that both the ML and this one had it makes me think it's probably more than just a one-off. It's a product of its time. It does seem to be a distinctly 90s and 2000s kind of thing where you have a lot of dead zone in certain cars, but I don't like it. It makes the car feel less sure than it should be, especially with all that performance on tap. Now, speaking to the performance, the difference between this and a C32 isn't as massive as you'd assume, given the engines, in terms of size and cylinders, being way different. One's a 3.2 supercharged V6, one's a naturally aspirated 5.4 V8. Now, the difference in power is that this one has, depending on who you ask, 362, 367 horsepower, that kind of region, to the 349 of that V6 engine car. So again, not a huge difference, only around, what, 20 horsepower between the two. The torque, though, is the main difference, and I will say you can feel it. And I'm going to talk about that difference in just a second. Because this car has 376 pound-feet to the 332 of that V6 engined C32 AMG. In terms of Newton meters, this one has 510, that car has 450. So a pretty big difference, a far more significant difference than the power. And the reason why it's significant as well is because this car is all torque. The C32, on the other hand, is all power. That engine, that supercharged V6, loves to be worked hard. Higher revs, keep your average speed up through corners, chuck it through those curves, as I said, very much like a hot hatch. It's very youthful. This one, it's just happy to waft along in a straight line, an Autobahn stormer, in complete comfort, relative silence, which for a lower grade model that's not an E or S class, it does a good job of. Nobody expects it to be as smooth or quiet as an S class, but for what it is, it's good. It is more of an older gents kind of AMG. Or in other words, pretty much exactly what I was expecting the E55 to be, and because it was more than that, it really impressed me and I enjoyed the car. Now, in terms of that performance, some will say it can do 0 to 60 in about 5 seconds, 5.2, that kind of region. I checked on the owners' forums, and some of those owners have used GPS verified timers, etc., and tried various runs in the car, and apparently some have even got it down to about 4.7, 0 to 60, which is about what you'd want from something like this. In terms of top speed, of course, it's limited to 155. It's not like you're going to use that most of the time, at least in the UK. Another downside of it is, potentially for some people at least, the fuel economy. This one, according to official specs, will do 16 in the city, 32 on the highway, and average 24. It doesn't. What you can actually expect, according to again owners and aggregator sites, is actually more like 17 to the gallon average, which in conjunction with that 13.6 UK gallon, or 62 litre, in other words, tank, you get about 230 miles out of the tank, which isn't exactly ideal. It reminds me of my Jag. In fact, the Jag doesn't have as big of a fuel tank as it deserves. It's kind of an issue here as well. Now, the final issue that I have with the car, the one which I mentioned being more subjective, is actually the interior. See, this is both a good point and not so good. The good point, first of all, is that this, without question, has far more space than the C32 does, which is weird, because it's the same platform. So clearly this car's seat controls allow you to sit further back and lower down than that C32 did, because I had way more space in this car, and you may even be able to see the difference if you compare the footage in this review to the footage in that C32 video. This one is definitely more roomy, even for me, so for a car of its size, that's a great sign. In terms of the rest of the car, you should probably expect about the same amount of space, at least if you compare sedan to sedan or wagon to wagon. But to go back to the not so good point, for me at least, and this applies to both this and the C32, the interior looks dated. To me, the air vents, the plastic, again, it's that Daimler Chrysler era of the early 2000s where it looks, to me, very cheap compared to what I'd want a Mercedes to look like. Some people probably won't care at all. And again, it depends very much so on what colour you choose. If you go for all black, you won't notice it as much, but with these lighter colours compared to the all black car that I drove before, you just notice the plastics and the buttons a bit more. Again, it's a personal thing. I value interior design more than most petrol heads, I know that, but in my opinion, I value it so much because it's where you are all the time. You drive the car from the inside, so as I've said before, you may as well enjoy being in the interior. To me, it's a little bit subpar in that regard, a little bit dated. It looks late 90s, early 2000s to me, but not as much in an endearing retro way as the E55 did, which is just pure 90s. In terms of its overall ability, there is no question that this car offers a huge amount for the money. You can buy one of these for about 8 to 10 grand currently in the UK, and I'm sure that varies a lot depending on where in the world you are, and also if you can even find one. Much like the C32, these are pretty rare. In fact, very rare. There are like a handful of these on Auto Trader, and when they come up, they don't tend to last that long. Most of them are silver, unsurprisingly, so if you are in the market for an absolute sleeper, there are a couple of options, and this is definitely one of them. And of course, these two aren't the only options. If you're willing to go a little bit older, you could even get something like a C36 AMG or the C43, both of which I'm yet to review but really hope to again in future. So who knows, maybe I'll be looking back on this video when I mention it in that video down the line, but we'll have to wait and see, of course. Overall, my verdict on the two cars, without getting too much into rivals match territory, is that, as I said earlier on in the video, it really is all down to what you want from the car. If you are younger, I believe strongly, probably something like 8 out of 10 times in fact, most younger drivers, say anyone under 30, will probably prefer the C32. It's simply more fun, and that's, as far as I'm concerned, really all there is to it. There's not much of an argument the other way. If you're older, 40s, 50s and beyond, I think you'll like this car quite a lot. It has very similar vibes to a laid-back, effortlessly torquey, big V8 Jag like an XJ or an S-Type, and I think it's all the better for it. That is, at the end of the day, probably who would be looking to buy one of these. And in case it seemed like I was dogging on the car a bit too much, there's plenty to like in terms of even the way it drives. The steering not so much, but the way it handles itself through corners is not impeded by that. As I said, it's just the feel of the steering kind of puts me off. In terms of brakes, for instance, it's really good. The brakes are very powerful on the car, and another great advantage that it has is, much like the C32, this is light. It's a much, much lighter car than certainly an S-Class, but even an E-Class. This weighs about the mid-1650 kilo region, which, to put that into perspective, is about the same as my aluminium-bodied Jag XKR. So for a sedan, or even in its wagon form with this large capacity engine to weigh that much, about the same as a GT car, that's a good sign, and you can feel it, for sure, both in the 32 and the 55 AMGs. The way they handle their weight through corners is good. They're not too soft or wallowy on the suspension like the ML55 unfortunately was, and apart from that steering dead zone, everything else is definitely up to scratch. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts on the C55 AMG of this generation. Of course, if you are a current owner of one of these, or maybe you were in the past, or you've driven one, or a C32 or one of the others that I mentioned, give me your thoughts down below, and not just for my benefit, but for other viewers as well. Maybe some warnings that you'd give to certain people, things to look out for. And of course, if you want to check out any of the other reviews that I've mentioned and referenced in this video, the ML, the E-Class, the C32, and of course everything else I've reviewed, Mercedes and beyond, then click the playlist right here on the screen and you can see every episode of Beards and Cars. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.